So I want you to imagine waking up inside the cockpit of this massive, incredibly complex commercial airliner in mid-flight.
Oh, that sounds terrifying.
Right, it is. You have no flight manual, absolutely no training, and the autopilot is locked behind some passcode you don't know.
And you're just watching all the dials spin.
Exactly. You can see the dial spinning, you can watch the altitude numbers shift, and you can see the direct results when you, push a throttle forward or pull a lever back.
You're watching the machine work in real time.
Yeah, taking your physical inputs and just spitting out physical outputs. But the underlying architecture, the actual wiring, the computer logic, governing why that specific lever moves that specific wing flap, it's completely hidden behind the dashboard.
It is, it's the ultimate black box problem. You are trapped observing the downstream effects, trying desperately to deduce the invisible, deterministic rules that generated them in the first place.
Right. It's a puzzle of observation. But today, for this deep dive, we are not looking at an airplane, and we aren't looking at a piece of compiled software either.
No, we're looking at something much closer to home.
We are looking at human cognition, the very thing you are using right now to listen to my voice and, make sense of these words.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. For you, the listener, the mission today is to execute a comprehensive end-to-end extraction of the architecture of thought itself.
A full map of the system.
Yes. We are going to map out the foundational building blocks of concepts, trace the rigid mechanics of logic, and examine those terrifying moments when that logic just breaks down into paradoxes.
And ultimately, we're going to look at how software engineers are trying to replicate this entire messy process into artificial intelligence.
Exactly. So how are we approaching this today?
Well, we're operating today in a highly technical, formal register. We'll be focusing heavily on causality and deterministic systems.
The nuts and bolts.
Right, the mereology. We will be analyzing how things break down and how component parts relate to the objects they actually form. And to accomplish this mapping, our sources span a massive spectrum.
We've got quite the reading list.
We really do. We have cognitive psychology frameworks, Aristotelian logic, modern AI deployment documentation, and, philosophy of mind from both the ancient East and the modern West.
So the goal is to weave all of that together.
That's the objective, to synthesize all these incredibly diverse perspectives into a single, cohesive map of how reasoning operates, how it catastrophically fails, and how it is synthetically replicated.
And before we take that first step, I think we need to draw a very clear boundary for you listening.
Yes, the disclaimer is important here.
We are going to be covering a lot of competing theories today. Some are these highly reductionist Western analytical models that, want to slice the brain into tiny mechanical pieces.
And others are holistic Eastern paradigms that view cognition as an interconnected flow.
Right. And we are going to impartially report on all of these frameworks based purely on the source material. We are not endorsing any specific philosophical paradigm or worldview as the absolute objective truth.
We are just exploring the blueprints to see how different architects have attempted to solve the exact same fundamental problems of existence and thought.
I like to think of us as cartographers today. We are mapping the territory, but we are making absolutely no claims to own the land.
I love that analogy. It's perfect.
So let's start at the absolute bottom, the bedrock.
The atomic level of thought.
Right. Before we can talk about complex reasoning or logic or AI, we have to isolate the fundamental substrate of thought, the basic building block, which is the concept.
Okay, yes, the concept.
If we are doing a component object analysis, breaking the big thing down into its smallest parts, what actually is a concept? Where does it live?
That question is, honestly, the foundational debate in both cognitive science and the philosophy of language. What is a concept, ontologically speaking?
Let me pause you right there because ontologically is a pretty heavy word. For someone walking their dog right now, what do we mean by the ontology of a concept?
Fair enough. Ontology is just the philosophical study of being. It asks, what kinds of things actually exist in the universe and how do we categorize them?
So just the study of what is real.
Exactly. So when we ask about the ontological status of a concept, we are basically asking, what is it? Is it a physical thing? Is it an illusion? Is it a biological process?
And what do our sources say?
The sources present three major competing views. The first is the mental representation view, which was heavily championed by the philosopher Jerry Fodor.
Fodor, right.
Yeah, he proposed something called the language of thought, hypothesis, which researchers often affectionately call mentalese.
Mentalese, like a secret language happening inside my brain that I don't even know I'm speaking.
In a way, yes. Fodor's framework argues that concepts are discrete mental particulars with semantic properties. They exist in the brain with a rigid language-like syntax and compositional semantics.
This sounds a lot like computer programming to me.
It's very similar, yeah.
Are you saying that in mentalese, a thought isn't just a vague cloud of feelings, but a highly structured entity, like a line of code in Python that has a subject, a predicate, and logical operators?
The computer code analogy is incredibly apt here. Fodor argues for an atomistic theory. Just as you build a complex software program out of individual atomic lines of code, your internal representation system builds complex thoughts out of component symbols.
So it's all physical, in a sense.
Right. These mental representations derive their meaning based on their functional and causal roles in your cognition. They are the physical-ish hardware states of your brain interacting.
That makes a certain intuitive sense. My brain is a biological machine, therefore my thoughts are just the biological code running on it.
That's the materialist appeal of it.
But I know that's not the only view out there. What is the alternative?
The primary alternative is the abstract object view, which is heavily influenced by the mathematician and philosopher Gottlob Frege.
Okay, Frege, how does he differ?
This view takes a radical departure from Fodor. In the Fregean view, concepts are not physical states in your brain. They are not psychological states at all.
Wait, really? Then what are they?
They are abstract entities, often referred to as A-objects. They exist entirely independently of human minds, and they act as mediators between the internal sense of a thing and its objective external reference in the real world.
Okay, I'm going to need a lifeline on this one.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
You're saying the concept of a dog doesn't live inside my head, but exists as some floating, invisible, abstract object out in the ether, and my brain just sort of reaches out and grabs it.
That is precisely the Fregean argument. When you think of a concept, your mind is essentially grasping this pre-existing abstract object.
Wow. Okay. And there's a third view.
Yes, to round out the big three, we also have the abilities view, often associated with Ludwig Wittgenstein. This view just straight up rejects both Fodor and Frege.
Typical Wittgenstein.
Right. Wittgenstein argues that concepts aren't objects at all. They aren't mental code, and they aren't floating abstract entities either. They are simply categorization skills.
A skill, like riding a bike.
Very much like that. To have the concept of a dog simply means you possess the cognitive ability to successfully point out and categorize dogs when you encounter them in your environment.
So it's something you do.
Exactly. It is an action you perform, not a thing you possess.
Okay, I have a massive problem with the Fregean abstract object framework, and I want to push back on it using some basic causal logic.
Let's hear it.
Let's assume we live in a deterministic physical universe governed by the laws of physics. If a concept exists as an abstract entity entirely outside of physical spacetime, how can it possibly interact with my physical brain?
Aye.
How does a non-spatial, non-physical abstract object trigger a physical neural event that makes me actually say the word dog?
It's the classic problem.
To me, that sounds like claiming the abstract blueprint of a house can somehow physically pick up a hammer and drive a nail into a piece of wood. It seems to completely violate the basic causal closure of the physical world.
You have just articulated the exact primary critique that philosophers of science have leveled against Fregean senses for over a century. The interaction problem.
It just doesn't compute for me.
How does the non-spatial interact with the spatial? Well, the sources provide a potential synthesis to resolve this tension, bridging the physical brain and abstract meaning by looking at how mental tokens link to cognitive content.
Okay, walk me through that. How do we build that bridge?
Imagine a person walking through a park and suddenly encountering a golden retriever. Light bounces off the dog, hits the person's retina, and travels down the optic nerve.
Pure biology so far.
Exactly. In the physical brain, a mental token is generated. At its core, this token is just a biological state, a cluster of neurons firing. Intrinsically, it is meaningless. It is just physical syntax. But this physical token gets cognitively linked to the properties the person is registering, the fur, the barking, the panting. The abstract object in this synthesized view just is the cognitive content of that physical mental token.
Ah, I see. So the mental token is the physical hardware state, the actual neurons firing in my skull. And the abstract object is the semantic meaning, the software, that we map onto that physical hardware.
That is the mechanism. And we see this physically realized through phenomena in neuroscience like ideesthesia.
Ideesthesia, what's that?
It's the biological linking of abstract semantic generation to sensory and cross-modal representations in the brain. Your brain generates a purely physical token, and through complex sensory binding, it acquires abstract semantic weight.
Okay, so we have isolated the fundamental particle, the concept, but how do we actually build them?
What do you mean?
Well, we aren't born knowing what a golden retriever is or what a mortgage is or what justice is. We have to construct these concepts from scratch.
For the architecture of concept formation, we actually look back to the philosopher Immanuel Kant.
Of course we do.
He outlined a very strict three-step operational algorithm for how the mind generates concepts. The first logical act is comparison.
Compare it.
The mind takes various mental images and sensory inputs and likens them to one another to find similarities.
So a toddler sees a golden retriever, a poodle, and a Great Dane. They don't know the word dog yet, but their brain is running a comparison algorithm, noting that all three have 4 legs, fur, and a tail.
Precisely.
What's step 2?
Step 2 is reflection. The mind takes those compared similar mental images and unifies them into a single, cohesive state of consciousness.
So making the connection.
Right. The child begins to realize that these separate experiences of different animals actually belong to a unified group. And then the final step is abstraction.
Abstraction seems like the hardest part.
It is where the mind deliberately segregates and drops the specific individual features to isolate only what is common to all the objects, stripping away the irrelevant noise.
The abstraction phase is crucial, isn't it? The child has to strip away the massive size of the Great Dane, the curly hair of the poodle, and the color of the golden retriever, realizing those details don't matter to the core category.
They extract the core dogness left behind.
Exactly.
Kant gives us the algorithm. But modern cognitive psychology takes this further by asking a structural question. Once that Kantian algorithm finishes running, what is the actual shape of the category it created in your brain?
Like, what does the boundary look like?
Yes. How do you define the boundaries of that concept? This has led to several competing structural theories of category membership, starting with the classical theory.
Let me guess, based on the name, classical theory is probably very rigid and mathematical.
Extremely rigid. The classical theory dictates that concepts are defined by strict, necessary, and sufficient conditions. It is a Boolean system, all or nothing.
Give me an example of a classical concept.
A triangle. A triangle is a closed, two-dimensional figure with 3 straight sides.
Okay, hard to argue with that.
Right. If a shape has 4 sides, it is fundamentally and unequivocally excluded from the category. There is no such thing as a fuzzy triangle. You either meet the definition or you do not.
But the classical theory completely falls apart when we step outside of geometry and into the real world, right? Because, human language and human concepts rarely have those kind of titanium-clad boundaries.
That realization led cognitive psychologists to develop prototype theory. It suggests that a concept isn't a strict checklist of rules, but rather an abstract, statistical average of features.
So it's more like a vibe than a rule book.
In prototype theory, categories have fuzzy boundaries, and membership is based on typicality.
Typicality. So if I ask you to think of a bird, you are probably going to picture a robin or a sparrow. You are not going to picture a penguin or an ostrich.
Exactly. A robin has incredibly high typicality because it closely matches the abstract average of the bird prototype. It flies, it's small, it sings.
And a penguin?
A penguin has very low typicality. It swims, it doesn't fly, it lives in the snow. Under the rigid classical theory, a penguin might actually break the rules of being a bird, depending on how you define it. But under prototype theory, it is still a bird, just a very peripheral, atypical one.
That makes perfect sense for how we navigate the world day to day. But are there theories that don't rely on abstract averages?
There is exemplar theory, which argues that we don't store an abstract average prototype at all. Instead, exemplar theory suggests we categorize new things by comparing them to specific individual memory instances that we have stored.
Oh, so instead of comparing a new animal to a generic average superdog in my head, my brain instantly flips through a Rolodex of every specific dog I have ever personally met.
Yes. Does this look like my childhood dog, Buster? Does this look like my neighbor's dog?
It's a completely nonlinear categorization.
It relies on episodic memory rather than semantic abstraction. And moving beyond just feature matching, we encounter the theory of concepts.
The theory. Nice naming convention there.
Psychologists are very literal. This framework argues that concepts are defined by underlying causal explanatory models.
That sounds intense. What does a causal explanatory model mean for an everyday concept?
It means that to possess a concept is to hold a naive, domain-specific theory about how that thing functions in reality. For example, your concept of water isn't just a list of features like wet and clear.
What else is it?
Your concept of water includes a naive physics theory about how it flows, how it freezes into ice, how it quenches thirst, and how it evaporates. The concept is bound to your understanding of its causal role in the world.
And zooming out to the widest possible lens, our sources mention meaning holism.
Yes, holism.
This is the idea that you can't evaluate a single concept in isolation. Concepts only derive meaning from highly interconnected semantic networks.
Meaning holism posits that you cannot possibly understand the concept of force in physics without simultaneously understanding the network of concepts surrounding it, like mass, acceleration, and gravity. Pluck one node out of the web and it becomes totally meaningless.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize what we've covered so far. We started at the absolute atomic level. We have mental tokens in our brains.
Yeah.
Through Kant's acts of comparison and abstraction, we bind these tokens into categories. Depending on what we are thinking about, we might use rigid classical definitions, fuzzy prototypes, memory-based exemplars, or complex causal theories.
But the cognitive system cannot just leave these concepts sitting in a disordered pile on the floor.
Yeah.
If you just have a million concepts floating around, you have a dictionary, but you don't have reasoning.
So we need structure.
The mind must organize these concepts into hierarchies, and it's very modest. He began with a fourfold division, mapping concepts on two intersecting axes, set of a subject and present in a subject.
This can get very dense very quickly. Can we break this down with a tangible example? Let's use a green apple sitting on a table.
Perfect. The first category is something that can be said of a subject, but is not present in a subject. This is a universal classification, like a genus.
So, like fruit.
Exactly. The concept fruit is said of the apple. It classifies it. But fruit is not a physical thing present inside the apple.
Okay, makes sense.
The second category is something that is present in a subject, but not said of it. This is an individual property. The specific, unique shade of green of that exact apple is physically present in the apple, but you wouldn't use that unique shade of green to classify other objects broadly.
Got it. And the third category is something that is both said of and present in.
This would be a universal property, the general concept of color. It is used to classify said of, and it represents a property that physically exists within the subject present in.
Which leaves the fourth category, something that is neither said of nor present in.
And that is the individual apple itself, the physical, distinct entity. You do not use this specific apple to classify other things, and the apple is not a property residing inside something else. It simply is itself.
And this specific physical entity, the apple, is what leads into Aristotle's massive tenfold division of categories, because he realizes that this entity, this neither category, is the absolute anchor for reality itself. He calls it substance.
Substance is the primary anchor of the Aristotelian universe.
Oh.
Substance is that which exists in itself. The apple, Socrates, a horse. Without substance, nothing else can exist.
And the other 9.
The other 9 categories, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, posture, state, action, and passion, are all secondary. They only have existence because they attach to a substance. Running, which is an action, cannot exist floating in a void. It requires a horse or a person, a substance, to perform it.
It's a brilliant way of filing reality into neat, understandable cabinets. But what really fascinates me in the sources is how Aristotle handles concepts that are slippery.
The ones that don't fit perfectly.
Right. Concepts that stretch across multiple categories without fitting neatly into a single box.
To solve this, Aristotle introduced a profoundly elegant mechanism called prose hen homonymy. It translates roughly to core-dependent homonymy. He recognized that we use the same word to describe entirely different categories of things, but they're all tethered to one core idea.
His famous example for this is the word healthy.
Yes. Consider 3 phrases: healthy urine, a healthy diet, and a healthy Socrates. Now, urine, a diet, and a human being do not share the same biological genus. They are completely different categories of things. But we apply the word healthy to all of them. Why?
Because they all orbit the same central core, just in different ways. Urine is healthy because it indicates health. A diet is healthy because it produces health. Socrates is healthy because he possesses health.
Exactly.
I can think of a modern equivalent, the word smart. We talk about a smartphone, a smart outfit, and a smart scientist.
That's a great comparison.
The phone has processing power, the outfit looks sharp, and the scientist is intelligent. totally different things, but they all relate back to a core concept of optimal functionality or intelligence.
The prose-hen homonymy ensures that our categories remain structured, even when language tries to stretch them out of shape. Now that we have established these static categories, we must set them into motion.
Time to add the engine.
We must examine the dynamic logical relations that allow us to calculate truths. This brings us to the strict mechanics of necessity and sufficiency, which is the absolute deterministic engine of reasoning.
This is a concept that trips up so many people, even in professional debates. Necessity versus sufficiency. Let's really hammer this down. We are defining a conditional statement, P implies Q. If P happens, then Q happens.
We must establish the strict parameters of these logical gates. Let us begin with necessity. If condition Q is necessary for condition P, it means P cannot possibly occur unless Q is present. Q is a mandatory prerequisite.
Give me a real-world anchor for necessity.
Oxygen is necessary for a fire. A fire will never, under any physical circumstance, ignite without oxygen. However, it is crucial to note that necessity does not equal causality or guarantee.
Because oxygen doesn't start the fire.
Exactly. Oxygen is in the room with us right now, but the room is not on fire. The presence of oxygen doesn't cause the fire, but its absence guarantees the fire cannot happen.
Another one would be age requirements. Being 30 years old is necessary to serve in the United States Senate. You cannot be a senator if you're 29. But just turning 30 doesn't magically make you a senator. It just unlocks the possibility.
That is necessity.
So what is sufficiency?
Sufficiency is a guarantee. If condition P is sufficient for condition Q, it means the presence of P absolutely guarantees the occurrence of Q. If P happens, Q is locked in.
So if I step outside and stand in a torrential downpour without an umbrella, that is sufficient to guarantee that my clothes will get wet.
Exactly. But notice the structural difference. Standing in the rain is sufficient for you to get wet, but it is not necessary.
Because I could get wet other ways.
You could jump into a swimming pool, or someone could throw a bucket of water on you. Sufficiency guarantees the outcome, but it rarely represents the only pathway to that outcome.
And the most powerful logical constructs happen when we combine them. Joint application. When conditions that are individually only necessary combine to become jointly sufficient.
The classic philosophical example here is the definition of a bachelor. For an entity to be a bachelor, it is necessary that the entity is unmarried. It is necessary that the entity is male. It is necessary that the entity is an adult.
Right. If you are male and unmarried, but you are 5 years old, you aren't a bachelor, you're a kindergartner. If you are an adult and unmarried, but female, you are a bachelorette. None of those traits alone guarantees the outcome.
But when you compound them unmarried, AND, an adult, they achieve joint sufficiency. The outcome is mathematically guaranteed.
Here's what I want you, the listener, to pause and consider. We are trying to map the messy, chaotic reality of human life using necessity and sufficiency, treating them like Boolean logic gates in a computer processor. True or false? 1 or 0.
It looks perfect on paper.
It sounds perfect on paper, but what happens when our sensory input is flawed? What happens when these strict rules are deliberately manipulated, either by someone making a mistake or someone actively trying to deceive you?
When the deterministic routing of necessity and sufficiency breaks down, the system experiences a degradation of inference. The machinery of reasoning grinds its gears and produces errors. In logic, we call these fallacies.
Fallacies are fascinating because they are basically cognitive optical illusions. They look like valid logic, but they are hollow inside.
They really are.
The taxonomy of error traces back again to our friend Aristotle, specifically his work Sophistical Refutations. He divided fallacies into verbal fallacies, where the language itself is ambiguous or tricky, and material fallacies, where the underlying reasoning is flawed.
Modern logic has refined this taxonomy into two main branches: formal fallacies and informal fallacies. Formal fallacies are fatal errors in structural validity. The mathematical syntax itself is broken. An example is affirming the consequent.
Let's hear the structure.
The structure is, if P, then Q is true. Therefore, P is true.
Let's plug real words into that broken math. If it is raining P, the street is wet Q. The street is wet Q, therefore it is raining P.
And that is invalid because, as we established with sufficiency, a street cleaner could have sprayed the street. Even if the premises are true, the structural routing guarantees an invalid conclusion.
What about informal fallacies?
Informal fallacies, on the other hand, are flaws in the premises or the semantic relevance of the data. The structure might loosely resemble a valid argument, but the payload is completely corrupted.
Let's walk through the specific mechanisms of these failures, because we see them every single day on the news, in boardrooms, and at the Thanksgiving dinner table. One of the most famous is petitio principii, which most people know as begging the question or its close cousin, circular reasoning.
In causal logic, circular reasoning is a fatal loop. The structure assumes the truth of the conclusion it is actively trying to prove. The architecture looks like this: P implies Q, Q implies R, and R implies P.
The sources provide a great grounded example of this. Imagine someone says BMWs are the most reliable cars in the world. You ask why. They respond, because nobody builds a more reliable car than BMW.
The warrant for the claim is just a restatement of the claim itself. The argument provides no external truth-functional evidence. It is a closed system that recursively validates itself without ever interacting with reality.
Another pervasive one is the false dilemma, or the false dichotomy. This is an artificial restriction of variables. You are presented with two mutually exclusive options, completely ignoring the vast spectrum of continuous variables between them.
It is forcing a binary Boolean choice onto a non-Boolean reality. You are either with us or you are with the enemy. It structurally deletes the possibility of neutrality, nuance, or alternative allegiances.
Then we have the red herring. I love the origin of this term. Historically, people would drag a pungent, smoked kipper or red herring across a trail to confuse tracking hounds and send them in the wrong direction.
A literal misdirection.
In logic, a red herring is the deliberate injection of orthogonal, unrelated data to disrupt discourse.
It is an evasion tactic. If someone is losing an argument about economic policy, they might suddenly pivot to an emotionally volatile tangent about a politician's personal scandal. The new topic has no structural bearing on the original argument, but it masks the invalidity of the primary defense by overloading the opponent with emotional noise.
And speaking of defensive tactics, there is kettle logic. This is one of the most bizarre and entertaining breakdowns we cover in this deep dive. Kettle logic occurs when multiple, contradictory defenses are deployed simultaneously.
The classic analogy, often attributed to Sigmund Freud, involves a leaky bucket.
Right. Imagine I borrow your bucket to wash my car. I return it to you, and you say, hey, there's a huge hole in this bucket. If I use kettle logic to defend myself, I will say three things.
Go on.
1, I never borrowed your bucket. 2, the bucket already had a hole in it when I borrowed it. And 3, the bucket was in pristine condition when I returned it.
If you evaluate those defenses individually, in isolation, any one of them would clear you of guilt. But their joint application creates a catastrophic contradiction. If you never borrowed it, it couldn't have had a hole when you borrowed it, nor could you have returned it in perfect condition. The defense matrix invalidates itself.
We also see fallacies that aren't about verbal tricks, but rather exploit the mathematical weaknesses in human psychology. These are statistical and cognitive fallacies. The conjunction fallacy is a prime example, famously demonstrated by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman.
The conjunction fallacy occurs when the human mind overestimates the probability of compounded, highly specific narratives over broader base rates. The famous experiment is the Linda problem. Linda is described as single, outspoken, and very bright. As a student, she was deeply concerned with discrimination and social justice.
Then the researchers ask participants to rank probabilities. Which is more mathematically likely? A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement?
Overwhelmingly, people choose option B. But from a purely structural probability standpoint, the conjunction of two events, bank teller and feminist, can never be more probable than one of those events occurring alone.
Because every feminist bank teller is, by definition, a bank teller.
Exactly. But the human mind prefers a detailed, emotionally resonant narrative over mathematical logic.
This ties directly into the base rate fallacy, where empirical baseline statistics are ignored in favor of localized anecdotal information. If you read a news story about a shark attack, you might refuse to go in the ocean, completely ignoring the base rate statistic that you are far more likely to die driving to the beach than from a shark.
So, what is the synthesis here? Why is our logic so fragile? Why are these fallacies so incredibly pervasive and persuasive?
Because they exploit the architecture of our biological hardware. Evolution did not optimize human cognition for rigorous Aristotelian conditional logic. It optimized us for heuristic pattern matching and rapid survival calculations.
If you hear a rustle in the bushes, you don't calculate the statistical probability of the wind versus a tiger you just run.
Exactly. Fallacies hack those ancient heuristics. They feel correct because they trigger our associative networks even as they brutally violate strict logical relationships.
So if our brains are naturally wired to fall for these traps, how do we protect ourselves? Over centuries, philosophers engineered epistemic filters. You can think of them as heuristic antivirus software for the mind. We call them razors.
When you are faced with conflicting arguments, a razor helps you shave away the improbable nonsense. Let's dig into the specific protocol for truth evaluation provided in our source data.
The foundational protocol is Occam's razor, formulated by William of Ockham, the principle of parsimony. It dictates that entities should not be multiplied without necessity.
Let's ground that. If I hear hoofbeats outside my window in Texas, Occam's razor tells me I should assume it's a horse, not a zebra. Given two competing theories that explain the same data, the one requiring the fewest assumptions and the least convolution is probabilistically most likely to be true.
Expanding on probability, we have the Sagan standard, popularized by the astronomer Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The weight of the required proof must scale proportionally with the claim's deviation from established empirical consensus.
If I tell you I have a dog in my house, you probably believe me. It's an ordinary claim. But if I tell you I have a fire-breathing dragon in my house, you are going to demand to see it, touch it, and measure the heat of its breath. The standard of evidence shoots through the roof.
And this is perfectly complemented by Hitchens' razor, named after Christopher Hitchens.
What's his razor?
Hitchens' razor states, "What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence." It is a symmetrical execution of logical burden. The burden of proof rests entirely and unequivocally on the person making the claim. If you present theory with zero empirical backing, I am not required to provide evidence to debunk it. I can simply dismiss it.
Then there is Hume's razor, from David Hume, which operates on causal proportionality. It demands that causes must be sufficiently able to produce the effect assigned to them. You cannot attribute a massive, globally complex effect to a minor, localized, and insufficient cause.
In the realm of scientific validation, the most critical filter is Popper's falsifiability principle, formulated by Karl Popper. For a theory or a claim to hold any scientific validity, it must possess the structural capacity to be disproven.
This is a huge one, and so often misunderstood. A theory isn't strong because it can explain everything. A theory is strong because it risks being wrong.
Precisely.
If I claim that an invisible, intangible, heatless dragon lives in my garage, there is no physical test you can run to prove me wrong. Because the claim is perfectly insulated against any negative evidence, it is structurally unfalsifiable. Therefore, according to Popper, it is outside the domain of science entirely. It's useless.
Which perfectly sets up Newton's flaming laser sword,
Yeah.
a brilliant, brutally efficient modern razor coined by mathematician Mike Alder. It states that if a proposition cannot be settled by experiment or empirical observation, it is simply not worth debating. It is the ruthless exclusion of non-experimental discourse from scientific progress.
I love the aggression in that game. Moving away from science and into human communication, we have Grace's razor. This is a linguistic filter that advises us to address the intended semantic meaning of a speaker, rather than hyperfixating on their literal syntactical output.
It prioritizes effective communication over weaponized pedantry.
Exactly. If we are at dinner and I say, "Can you pass the salt?" and you say, "Yes, I am physically capable of doing that," and then you just stare at me without passing the salt, you are violating Grice's razor. You are choosing to interpret the literal syntax of my question as an inquiry about your physical abilities, deliberately ignoring the obvious semantic intent, which was a polite request.
And finally, we have Hanlon's razor, an incredibly useful filter for evaluating human behavior and navigating society. It states, "Never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by incompetence or stupidity."
It's a cognitive dampener against paranoia. If someone cuts you off in traffic, they probably aren't a malicious assassin targeting you. They're probably just a bad driver looking at their phone.
It reminds us that systemic failure, simple error, and localized incompetence are far more mathematically probable events in a chaotic universe than highly coordinated malicious conspiracies.
I have to pause and challenge Hanlon's razor here, though. Let's look at large organizations or governments. At what point does compounded incompetence mathematically equate to malice in a complex system?
That's a dark thought.
Well, if an organization is so profoundly, deeply incompetent that its actions result in massive, predictable harm to thousands of people, and they continually refuse to correct that incompetence over years, doesn't the distinction between malice and stupidity become functionally meaningless to the victims?
This is a vital philosophical pushback, and it reveals the inherent limits of these epistemic filters. Razors are not absolute unbreakable laws of physics. They are probability-based algorithms designed for cognitive efficiency.
So they can be wrong.
Hanlon's razor doesn't guarantee that malice doesn't exist. It simply establishes that incompetence is the higher probability default baseline. When incompetence becomes weaponized, shielded from consequence, or structurally preserved despite causing harm, the filter must be manually adjusted by the observer.
So razors help us trim away the bad arguments, the fallacies, and the paranoid assumptions. But what happens when the cognitive system encounters a problem that is structurally valid, perfectly reasoned, yet completely destructive?
We are talking about paradoxes.
If a fallacy is a user error, a paradox is a catastrophic system crash. It is an instance where valid reasoning, applied to perfectly valid premises, yields a fatal, universe-breaking contradiction.
In formal logic and computer science, we treat these as recursive breakdowns. The system gets caught in an infinite loop. The most ancient and persistent of these are self-referential paradoxes, and the quintessential example is the liar paradox. This statement is false.
Let's trace the loop of the liar paradox slowly for the listener, so they can feel the system crash in their own brain. This statement is false. If we assume the statement is true, then what it says must be a fact, but what it claims is that it is false. So it is false.
But wait, if the statement is false, then its claim that it's false is untrue, which means it must actually be true.
The truth value oscillates infinitely. True, false, true, false. You cannot assign a stable Boolean state. It creates a global triviality in logic if left unchecked. A much more dangerous evolution of this is Curry's paradox.
Curry's paradox is vicious.
It utilizes a conditional statement to infect the entire system. If this sentence is true, then P can be literally any arbitrary proposition.
Let's make P something absurd. If this sentence is true, then Santa Claus exists.
Let us trace the logic using the strict rules of material implication. If we assume the sentence is true, then the antecedent, the if part, is true, which forces the consequent, the then part, to be true. Therefore, Santa Claus exists.
But what if we say this sentence is false?
This is where Curry's paradox maliciously manipulates the definition of a conditional. In classical logic, if the antecedent of a conditional is false, the entire statement is automatically evaluated as true.
Wait, really?
Yeah, for example, if pigs can fly, then I am a billionaire is considered a logically true statement because the impossibility of the premise makes the conditional trivially true. So if we assume Curry's sentence is false, the conditional mechanism makes it true, yielding a contradiction. By exploiting this, Curry's paradox effectively allows you to logically prove absolutely anything, completely collapsing the foundational framework of mathematical truth.
That is terrifying for mathematicians. And we actually saw this happen in real life with Russell's paradox, discovered by Bertrand Russell. In early naive set theory, mathematicians believed you could create a set out of literally any defining property.
Like any property.
Any property. You could have the set of all red things, the set of all numbers. And importantly, sets could contain themselves. The set of all non-dogs is itself a non-dog, so it contains itself.
Russell looked at this unrestricted freedom and asked a fatal question. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this master set contain itself?
Let's trace the crash. If it does contain itself, then by definition it belongs to the group of sets that do not contain themselves, so it must be kicked out. It does not contain itself.
But if it does not contain itself, it suddenly meets the exact criteria for inclusion, so it must be put back in and contain itself.
This antinomy, this massive contradiction, literally destroyed naive set theory in the early 20th century. It proved the foundation of mathematics was flawed. It forced logicians to spend decades rebuilding the entire foundation of math with rigorous axiomatic systems, like Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, specifically designed to build firewalls that prevent unrestricted set formation.
For a long time, logicians tried to blame these paradoxes entirely on the mechanism of self-reference. They thought, if we just ban sentences from talking about themselves or sets from containing themselves, we fix the crash. But then a philosopher named Stephen Yablo developed Yablo's paradox.
Yablo's paradox is a critical, devastating evolution. Imagine an infinite sequence of sentences written on an endless piece of paper. Sentence 1 says, all subsequent sentences below me are false. Sentence 2 says, all subsequent sentences below me are false. And this repeats infinitely.
If sentence 1 is true, then sentence 2 is false. But if sentence 2 is false, that means the sentences below it are true, which contradicts sentence 1.
Precisely. Yablo achieves the exact same logical contradiction without any circularity or self-reference. Sentence 1 never refers to itself, it only refers to the infinite sequence below it. It proves that the architectural flaw in our logic is much deeper than mere self-reference.
And moving beyond self-reference, we have paradoxes of semantic boundaries and vagueness. The most famous is the Sorites paradox, also known as the heap paradox. You take a massive heap of sand, you remove one single grain, it is still a heap. You remove another grain, still a heap.
The logic here relies on the premise that a single grain of sand cannot logically constitute the defining threshold between a heap and a non-heap. Because you accept that premise, you follow this valid logic all the way down grain by grain until there's only one grain left or zero grains, and you are forced to conclude that a single grain of sand is a heap.
The bald paradox operates on the exact same logic. Losing one hair doesn't make a hairy man bald. So you lose one, then another, until the man has no hair, but logic dictates he isn't bald.
This is a total breakdown of quantitative vagueness. The classical, rigid Aristotelian logic of necessity and sufficiency completely fails when faced with continuous spectrums. The resolution to this paradox requires abandoning binary boundaries and adopting fuzzy logic, where absolute truth values are replaced with continuous degrees between 0 and 1. A collection of sand is not 100% heap or 0% a heap. It exists on a mathematical spectrum of heapness.
Synthesizing this entire section, paradoxes are the ultimate proof that our linguistic and logical models, our concepts, our mentalese, our Aristotelian categories, do not perfectly map onto the physical ontology of the universe. The map is not the territory.
It never is.
The universe is continuous, but our logic tries to chop it into discrete pixels, and in the gaps between those pixels, paradoxes are born.
That is a profound realization. And having dissected the ontology of those concepts, the rigid rules of logic that govern them, and the systemic paradoxes that crash them, we must now turn our analytical lens to the hardware that is actually running these processes.
The brain itself.
The locus of experience, the human mind.
We are going to look at how different cultures have tried to explain this hardware. We will examine Western analytical paradigms and Eastern holistic paradigms. In the West, the dominant modern discourse revolves around what philosopher David Chalmers coined the hard problem of consciousness.
Chalmers makes a vital distinction. We can map the neural correlates of cognition. We can put you in an fMRI machine and see exactly which neurons fire in your visual cortex when you look at a red apple. We can trace the mechanical processing of light into electrical signals. Chalmers calls these the easy problems, not because they are simple, but because they're solvable through standard mechanical science.
Right. But the hard problem is, why does that physical firing of neurons produce the subjective, internal, qualitative experience of seeing the color red? Why does it feel like anything at all to be a human being? If we are just biological machines executing code, why aren't we just dark inside?
Chalmers also introduced the meta-problem, which asks a fascinating secondary question. Why do humans even think there is a hard problem to begin with? Why are our brains wired to find our own consciousness so mysterious? To attempt to explain this, Western cognitive science relies heavily on architectural mechanical models. One of the most prominent is global workspace theory, developed by Bernard Baars and Stanislas Dehaene.
Global workspace theory is often explained using a theater analogy. Imagine your brain is a massive, dark theater. On the stage, under a bright spotlight, are the things you are consciously aware of right now: my voice, the temperature of the room.
Unconscious processors operate in the dark offstage. They're constantly crunching data, regulating your heartbeat, parsing syntax, scanning your peripheral vision. But when a piece of information is deemed important enough, it is broadcast to the global workspace. It is pulled into the spotlight. When it hits the spotlight, it integrates neural assemblies across the entire brain, and that widespread broadcast is what we experience as consciousness.
It views consciousness as a cognitive spotlight. Conversely, we have integrated information theory, or IIT, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. This theory doesn't use analogies. It attempts to quantify consciousness purely mathematically.
IIT posits a mathematical value, represented by the Greek letter phi. Phi measures the amount of integrated information generated by a complex system, above and beyond the information generated by its individual parts. It measures how interconnected the system is. If a system's phi value is greater than 0, IIT argues that the system possesses some degree of subjective consciousness.
Which implies that even simple systems, maybe even a thermostat or a complex computer network, have a tiny fractional glimmer of consciousness if their phi is above 0. This brings up intense, uncomfortable debates in the West about personal identity. If consciousness is just a mathematical value of information or a broadcast spotlight on a stage, what makes you? You, where is the self?
The philosopher Derek Parfit argued for a highly reductionist view. He believed that the concept of a persistent self over time is an illusion. What matters isn't a permanent soul, but rather psychological continuity, the chain of memories and personality traits passing from one moment to the next. Daniel Dennett took this even further.
Dennett is famous for describing the self as a center of narrative gravity. I find this brilliant. He argues that just as a physical object has a center of gravity which isn't a physical thing, just a mathematical abstraction representing balance, your brain creates the self. It is an abstract fiction generated by our brain's storytelling mechanisms to keep track of its own complex actions and maintain a coherent timeline. You are just the protagonist of a story your brain is writing in real time.
Now, contrast these computational, highly reductionist Western models with the Chinese philosophy of mind. These Eastern holistic paradigms attempt to resolve the gap between objective external reality and internal subjective representation through entirely different mechanisms. They do not chop the mind into spotlights and math equations. Look at Taoism, particularly the writings of Zhuangzi.
Zhuangzi's framework is built on two core flowing concepts, Tao and Dai. The Tao is the ineffable monistic principle that guides the spontaneous, natural processes of the entire universe. It is the way of all things. Dai is the inner power, or virtue, which is the manifestation of the Tao residing within an individual.
The textual history of the Zhuangzi is layered and complex. The inner chapters focus heavily on spontaneous, flowing modes of cognition. The ultimate goal of the sage is not to rigidly categorize the world using Aristotelian logic, but to achieve a state of unself-conscious action wu wei, merging seamlessly with the Tao.
It is about flow states. A butcher cutting an ox not by looking at the joints and calculating geometry, but by feeling the natural spaces and letting the knife flow through them.
But the text is diverse. You also have the outer and miscellaneous chapters, which contain primitivist visions of return to simple utopias, Yangist concepts focusing on the preservation of one's physical and biological nature, and syncretist attempts to organize human society hierarchically, mirroring the cosmic patterns.
We also see incredible depth regarding the mind in Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Neo-Confucianism. The Chan or Zen Buddhist debates were intensely focused on analyzing the relationship between the pure enlightened mind and the defiled everyday mind caught in illusion.
They debated whether the pure mind and the defiled mind are two completely separate entities, or simply two different aspects of the exact same consciousness. Neo-Confucian thinkers later achieved a grand synthesis, linking the macro structure of the cosmos directly to Sin, the heart mind. The order of the universe and the moral order of the human mind were seen as a single, unified continuum.
If I can draw an analogy to compare these paradigms, Western philosophy treats the mind almost like a mechanic treats an engine. It isolates the spark plugs, the pistons, the categorical logic, trying to define the exact boundaries of every part. Zhuangzi and the Eastern holistic traditions treat the mind like a fluid dynamic system. It behaves like water. It seeks the path of least resistance, bypassing rigid classical categorizations to achieve a unified inactive interaction with the world.
A very astute comparison. The West attempts to capture reality by putting it into highly specific, sharply defined conceptual boxes. The East attempts to capture reality by tearing down the boxes entirely and becoming the water flowing through the space. Yet both are fundamentally attempting to solve the exact same human problem, reconciling the profound dissonance between the external physical reality and our internal subjective experience.
And that brings us to the ultimate synthesis, the final frontier of our deep dive today. We have explored the deep theories of concepts, the strict mechanics of logic, the catastrophic crashes of paradoxes, and the profound philosophy of the human mind. Now, what happens when human engineers in the 21st century take all of this, the logic, the language, the concepts, and try to synthesize it into silicon? We are moving into the applied engineering of synthetic cognition, specifically large language models and AI.
The foundational challenge is testing. How do you test a machine that generates non-deterministic thought? In traditional deterministic software engineering, testing is simple. You write a unit test. You put input X into the function, you expect output Y. If the software outputs Z, the test fails and the engineer fixes the code.
But an AI, an LLM like ChatGPT or Claude, doesn't output deterministic binary results. It outputs semantic spectrums. If you ask an LLM to explain a black hole like I'm a 5-year-old, it will give you a different, unique answer every single time you press generate. So traditional unit testing completely breaks down. You can't write a test that expects one specific string of text.
Because of this non-determinism, our sources on deployment documentation dictate that you cannot evaluate an LLM in isolation in a lab. You must rely on AI output A/B testing in live production. You have to test it on real humans in real time, using probabilistic routing.
Let's unpack the architecture of probabilistic routing because it's a fascinating engineering solution. In standard web development, if you get 1 million visitors to your website, you use a network load balancer. It blindly sends 50% of traffic to server A and 50% to server B just to keep the servers from crashing.
But with AI, the routing cannot happen at the blind network layer. It has to happen at the application layer. This is because the difference between variant A and variant B in an AI test isn't just a server hardware difference. It might be a subtle shift in the system prompt or the semantic parameters. You are actively manipulating the input JSON payload dynamically before it ever hits the LLM.
And because you are dynamically routing these cognitive parameters, you have to maintain strict context. Engineers use something called sticky sessions.
Sticky sessions are critical for LLMs. If a user is interacting with an AI chatbot and their first request is routed to a baseline model instructed to act like a polite tutor, and their second request is randomly routed to an experimental model instructed to act like a concise scientist, the semantic cohesion breaks entirely.
To borrow Daniel Dennett's philosophy from earlier, the narrative gravity of the session collapses. The AI basically gets a lobotomy and sudden amnesia mid-conversation. The user experiences cognitive whiplash. So sticky sessions ensure that once you start talking to a specific version of the AI, you stay locked to that version for the duration of the context window.
To manage this immense complexity without crashing the application, engineers rely on a paradigm called configuration over code. You do not hard code your system prompts or your routing percentages into the compiled software. You manage them using external environment variables.
This gives the engineers a kill switch. You set an environment variable that says, send 10% of our live user traffic to this new, highly experimental AI model. If that experimental model suddenly starts hallucinating, degrading into kettle logic, or spewing fallacies, you don't have to rewrite the code and push an update. You just flip the variable back to 0.
However, this raises the telemetry problem. When you are A/D testing AI in the wild, how do you mathematically prove that the experimental model is actually producing better semantic concepts than the baseline? You cannot rely on traditional web metrics like uptime or server ping. You must capture explicit semantic telemetry.
The absolute requirement here, according to the deployment docs, is explicit feedback loops paired with foreign keys in a database.
Let us explain the foreign key architecture. When a user clicks a thumbs down icon on a bad AI response, that feedback is entirely useless if the engineering team doesn't know exactly what generated the text.
Right. Think of a foreign key like the receipt at a restaurant. If you complain that your burger was undercooked, the manager needs the receipt to see exactly which cook made it, at what time, on what grill. Your database telemetry must log the specific model version, the exact temperature setting determining randomness, the system prompt ID, and the unique request ID.
You bind all that rich metadata to the user's thumbs down feedback via a foreign key. That database structure allows you to attribute the failure of synthetic thought back to highly specific granular cognitive parameters. It allows you to deduce the architecture.
But there's a massive trap here that engineers face called latency blindness. There is a brutal, unavoidable trade-off between the semantic quality of the AI's reasoning and the time-to-first token, which is how fast the AI starts typing its response.
You might route user traffic to a brilliantly reasoned, highly complex model that perfectly avoids formal fallacies. But if it takes 5 seconds longer to process the abstract syntax and generate the first word than your dumber baseline model, user satisfaction will mathematically plummet.
Users are impatient. The cognitive quality of the synthetic thought becomes completely irrelevant if the latency destroys the inactive interaction. If the flow state is broken, the user leaves. It is a profound irony. In AI engineering, we are effectively taking all the fuzzy logic, all the chaotic, non-deterministic conceptual theory of human thought that we've discussed today, and we are desperately trying to force it into a formal, deterministic software testing structure. We are using strict Boolean gates to evaluate a fluid dynamic system.
It is the ultimate collision of the two paradigms we have been analyzing for the last hour. We are attempting to build a rigid, objective mathematical map of an inherently fuzzy subjective process.
What an incredible, sprawling journey today. We have traversed an unbroken line across the entire architecture of cognition. We started with the deep ontological debate over abstract mental representations and Phrygian objects. We built those basic concepts into the rigid Aristotelian structures of categorical logic and necessity. We watched that very logic degrade through human fallacies and then completely crash into the recursive loops of Russell's and Yablow's paradoxes. We explored how the human mind, through the Western lens of integrated information and the Eastern lens of Taoist fluid dynamics, acts as the hardware for these chaotic processes. And finally, we saw how probabilistic routing and sticky sessions attempt to rein in the non-deterministic output of modern large language models.
And yet, after mapping this entire landscape, a critical vulnerability remains. A question that builds upon everything we have extracted today, but points toward an unresolved and potentially unsolvable future in computing.
I know exactly where you're going with this. We leave you, the listener, with this final provocative thought. We established earlier that human language is inherently, unavoidably vulnerable to the Sorites paradox, the mathematical vagueness of concepts like the heap of sand or the bald man. The boundaries of human language are always fuzzy, never Boolean.
And large language models are trained entirely on the massive corpus of that exact fuzzy human language.
Therefore, are AI systems fundamentally mathematically bound to eventually replicate our logical paradoxes? Can a synthetic cognition running on silicon ever truly resolve vagueness? Or will AI eventually hit a conceptual wall and be forced to invent entirely new synthetic philosophical razors of its own just to cope with the maddening ambiguity of its human training data?
A system trained on paradox cannot logically escape paradox. It can only learn to navigate the contradiction.
Keep questioning the architecture of your own cognition. We will see you on the next deep dive.